Growing up in the backwoods of Montana, I learned to track, hunt, and survive in the most rugged terrain you could imagine. That's probably why I joined the Marines, I guess. The discipline, the challenge, the thrill of pushing myself beyond my limits, it all called to me like a siren song. After a few tours in the desert, though, I was more than ready for a change of scenery. I just didn't realize how drastic that change would be. It all started when I got leave to come home for a couple of weeks. My dad had passed away while I was deployed, and I hadn't been able to make it back for the funeral. I felt like I needed some time to process, to grieve in my own way, and I figured there was no better place to do that than the old hunting cabin my dad and I used to go to every fall. The cabin was deep in the forest, about 20 miles from the nearest town. It was a real secluded spot, surrounded by dense pines and rough terrain, just the way I liked it. I packed light, my rifle, a few days' worth of supplies, and a bottle of bourbon I planned to sip while I remembered the old man. I arrived just before dusk, the setting sun casting long shadows over the landscape. The first couple of nights were uneventful. I spent my days hiking through familiar trails, listening to the birds and the rustling of leaves. It was quiet, peaceful even, the kind of place where you could almost forget about the rest of the world. Almost. On the third night, I was sitting on the porch, sipping from my flask, when I heard something out in the woods. It was faint at first, like a distant howl. I figured it was just a coyote or maybe a wolf. We had those out here, though they usually kept to themselves. But as the minutes passed, the howling grew louder, more intense. And then it stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. That's when I felt it, a strange, unnerving sensation, like I was being watched. I'm not one to get spooked easily, but something about that silence set my teeth on edge. I scanned the tree line, my eyes straining in the darkness. For a moment, I thought I saw something move, a large shadow darting between the trees. But it was gone in an instant, and I chalked it up to my imagination, or maybe the bourbon. I decided to head inside, lock up for the night. But as I turned to go back into the cabin, I heard it again, closer this time, a low, guttural growl that sent a chill down my spine. I spun around, my hand instinctively reaching for the rifle slung over my shoulder. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest was still, the air thick with tension. And then there it was, a massive shape, just beyond the tree line, watching me. It was tall, easily 8 feet, maybe more, covered in thick, matted hair. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, reflecting the faint light of the moon. I knew immediately what it was, though my mind tried to reject the possibility. Sasquatch, I'd heard the stories, of course, go had, but I'd never given them much thought. Just old wives' tales. I'd always assumed campfire stories to scare the kids. But now, seeing it with my own eyes, I realized how wrong I'd been. This was no campfire story. This was real, and it was right in front of me. I raised my rifle, aiming for the creature's chest. I didn't want to shoot unless I had to, but I wasn't taking any chances. The creature didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me with those eerie, glowing eyes. I could feel the weight of its gaze, heavy and oppressive, like it was sizing me up, deciding whether or not I was a threat. For a moment, neither of us moved. It was a standoff, a silent battle of wills. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the creature turned and vanished back into the woods, its massive form melting into the shadows. I stood there for a long time, my rifle still raised, my heart still pounding. What the hell had I just seen? I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window with my rifle across my lap, my eyes fixed on the tree line, waiting for the creature to return. But it never did. As the first light of dawn broke, I finally allowed myself to relax, though I knew I wouldn't be able to rest until I had some answers. The next day, I decided to track it. I wasn't sure what I'd find, but I couldn't just leave without knowing what was out there. I grabbed my gear and set off into the woods, following the path where I'd seen the creature disappear. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so. No birds, no insects, just an eerie, suffocating silence. I followed the tracks for hours, my eyes scanning the ground for any sign of movement. The tracks were large, much larger than any bear I'd ever seen, and they were fresh. I knew I was getting close. As I moved deeper into the forest, I started to notice signs, strange markings on the trees, like claw marks or scratches, some old and faded, others fresh and jagged. It was clear this creature had been here for a long time, maybe even its whole life. And it wasn't alone. I came to a clearing, and that's when I saw it, a makeshift den, hidden among the rocks and trees. I crouched down, moving slowly, carefully. I could hear movement inside, a low rumble that sounded almost like breathing. My heart was racing, my palms slick with sweat. I crept closer, trying to get a better look. And then I saw them, two smaller creatures, lying in the den. They were similar to the one I'd seen the night before, but smaller, less imposing. They were asleep, or at least I hoped they were. As I watched, I felt a chill run down my spine. I realized with a start that these creatures weren't the offspring of the one I'd seen. They were a different kind altogether. Smaller, leaner, but no less dangerous. I knew I needed to get out of there, but as I turned to leave, I felt a presence behind me. I spun around, my rifle at the ready, and there it was, the big one, the one I'd seen the night before. It was standing just a few feet away, its eyes locked onto mine. I could see the intelligence in its gaze, the cold calculation. This wasn't just an animal, this was a predator, and I was in its territory. I knew I couldn't outrun it. My only chance was to stand my ground, to show it I wasn't afraid. I kept my rifle trained on the creature, my finger hovering over the trigger. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, without warning, the creature lunged at me. I fired a shot, but it went wide, the recoil throwing off my aim. The creature was on me in an instant, its massive hand swiping at my rifle, knocking it from my grip. I stumbled back, falling to the ground as the creature loomed over me, its hot breath washing over my face. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing a nearby branch to defend myself. The creature roared, a deafening sound that shook me to my core, but I didn't back down. I swung the branch with all my might, catching the creature across the face. It let out a howl of pain. Staggering back for a moment, I took the opportunity to make a run for it, sprinting through the trees as fast as my legs would carry me. I could hear the creature behind me, crashing through the underbrush, its growls echoing in my ears. I didn't dare look back. I just ran, my lungs burning, my heart pounding. After what felt like an eternity, I burst out of the woods and into the clearing where the cabin stood. I slammed the door behind me, locking it tight, and grabbed my spare rifle from the corner. I stood there, panting, my eyes fixed on the door, waiting for the creature to come crashing through. But it never did. The forest was silent once more, the only sound my own ragged breathing. I knew I couldn't stay here. I had to get out, had to warn someone about what I'd seen. But as I packed my things, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that the creature was still out there, watching, waiting. I left the cabin that afternoon, heading back to town as fast as I could. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. Who would believe me? But I knew what I'd seen was real, and I knew I couldn't go back. Not to the cabin, not to the woods, not ever. Months passed, and I tried to put the encounter behind me, but the memories lingered, haunting me every night. I knew I'd never be able to forget what I'd seen. And then one day I received a call that pulled me back into the nightmare. It was my old buddy from the Marines, Tyler. We hadn't spoken much since I'd come back from that trip, mostly because I hadn't wanted to talk to anyone. But his voice sounded urgent, more serious than usual. "Hey man, I need you to hear me out," he said, his voice low and tense. "I know you've been through some stuff, but I've been hearing some crazy things. People have been disappearing out near your dad's old cabin. Local law enforcement is saying it's animal attacks, but the way they're talking about it, it's weird, man. Real weird." I felt my blood run cold. I had hoped the creature would stay deep in the woods, away from people. But it sounded like things were escalating. I knew I couldn't ignore it. I needed to go back to find out what was happening. I packed up my gear again, this time including a couple of traps and more firepower. I didn't know what I'd find, but I wasn't going in unprepared. I called Tyler and told him to meet me out near the cabin. If something had to be done, I couldn't do it alone. The drive up felt longer than ever, each mile stretching out like an eternity. When I finally arrived, Tyler was already there, looking uneasy. He had brought along some heavy-duty hunting gear, and his face was pale. "You really think we're going to find something out here?" he asked, trying to mask the fear in his voice. I didn't answer right away. I don't know, but we have to be ready for anything. We made our way into the woods, moving carefully, eyes scanning every shadow. The silence was back, thick, oppressive. We didn't see any tracks, but I could feel it in my gut. We weren't alone. Hours passed as we moved deeper into the forest. Suddenly, we heard a faint noise, like the snapping of a twig. Tyler and I exchanged a look and readied our weapons. The noise came again, closer this time. I could feel my heart in my throat. Then we saw it. A figure moving through the trees, not more than 50 feet away. It was big, bigger than the one I had seen before. My blood froze as it stepped into the clearing, its massive form towering over the bushes. This one looked meaner, more aggressive, and it was staring right at us. Holy! Tyler muttered, raising his gun. Not shoot, I hissed. Not yet. Let's see what it does. The creature growled, a deep, menacing sound that rumbled through the forest. It began to move toward us, slow and deliberate. Tyler and I slowly backed up, trying not to make any sudden movements. My mind raced. If this thing attacked, we wouldn't have much time to react. And then, out of nowhere, there was a roar from behind us, louder than anything I had ever heard. We spun around to see another creature, smaller, but no less intimidating. It was flanking us, cutting off our escape. Go, now, I shouted, pushing Tyler to run. We sprinted through the woods, branches slapping against our faces, our feet stumbling over roots and rocks. I could hear the creatures behind us, their heavy footsteps pounding the ground. The forest seemed to close in around us, every shadow a threat. We burst into a small clearing and skidded to a halt. Ahead of us was a steep drop-off, a cliffside plunging down into darkness. There was nowhere to go. This way. Tyler shouted, pointing to a narrow path along the edge of the cliff. It was barely wide enough for us to squeeze through, but it was our only option. We darted onto the path, hugging the cliff wall, our backs pressed against the cold rock. I glanced back and saw the creatures pause at the edge of the clearing. They seemed hesitant, unsure about the narrow path. For a moment, I thought we might have bought ourselves some time. But then one of the creatures stepped forward, testing the ground with his foot, and began to follow. Keep moving, I urged Tyler, trying to stay calm. We couldn't stop. Not now. The path was treacherous, every step a potential disaster. Below us, the drop was dizzying, and one wrong move would mean a quick, painful end. We inched along, the creatures gaining on us. The larger one led the way, its massive frame making the path look even smaller. I could feel the sweat pouring down my face, my muscles aching with tension. And then, just as we rounded a bend in the path, I saw it, a small cave, barely visible in the shadows. In there, I yelled, pushing Tyler toward it. We dove into the cave, the darkness swallowing us. I scrambled to the back, pressing myself against the cool stone, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Tyler was beside me, his eyes wide with fear. Outside, the creatures were still on the path, but they seemed reluctant to follow us into the cave. I could hear them growling, pacing back and forth. I knew we weren't safe, but at least we had a moment to breathe. What now? Tyler whispered. I shook my head, trying to think. We couldn't stay here forever. Sooner or later, the creatures would come in after us. We needed a plan. Suddenly, an idea came to me. I reached into my pack and pulled out a flare. This might buy us some time, I said, striking it against the rock. The flare ignited, casting a harsh red light that filled the cave. I moved to the entrance and threw the flare out onto the path. The creatures recoiled, hissing at the sudden brightness. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make them hesitate. Go, I shouted to Tyler. While they're distracted, we bolted out of the cave and sprinted down the path, the flare still burning brightly behind us. The creatures roared in anger but didn't follow, at least not immediately. We ran like hell, pushing ourselves to the limit. After what felt like forever, we finally made it back to the main trail. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of the cabin. We slammed the door shut, barricading it with whatever we could find. For a long time, we just sat there, trying to catch our breath, our bodies trembling with adrenaline and fear. We had made it out, but just barely. And I knew that the creatures were still out there, lurking in the shadows waiting. I don't know what those things were or where they came from, but one thing is certain. The woods around that old cabin are no longer safe, and I'll never go back there again.